Are you an adventurer looking to take your hunt to the next level? Then you're in the right place. Welcome to East Meets West Hunt with your host, Beau Martonik.
Hey everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of the East Meets West Hunt podcast presented by Spartan Forge. On today's episode, I am joined by Bill Thompson of Spartan Forge, and we are talking all about the rut, and specifically what Bill has learned from looking at tons of colored GPS data from different parts of the U.S. and how that applies to hunting the big woods during the rut. We just discuss doe bedding, how bucks move during different phases of the rut, lockdown areas, stand strategies, and hunting scrapes, and much more. So this podcast is also just brought to you by the Spartan Forge app, which Bill is the founder of. It utilizes years of military background and machine learning to pull from millions of data points to accurately predict deer movement, including GPS data of, as Bill has said, accumulation of up to 2,000 years of GPS data, 30 years of weather, academic, and state research. The new app will include GPS mapping with incredible aerial imagery, offline dependability, deer prediction, weather updates, journal entries, and much more. As you'll hear coming up here, Bill had said that the app is in the App Store's hands right now for the full production version. So that could be out as early as today, or that might be a couple days out. But it's exciting to see that going into production, and appreciate everyone being patient with that, with the new app launch. You can use the code EastMeetsWest to save 25% off of the Spartan Forge app at spartanforge.ai. Tethered is a company founded on the principles of educating the hunting community on saddle hunting while creating the most innovative, lightweight, safe products for saddle hunting. They have mobile gear hunting options for all types of hunters, and they're continuing to push the envelope. I'm running the Phantom saddle, the Predator platform. I'm running cis haulers on each side, the 8mm ropes. I've got the full setup from Tethered, and just a tip for all-day sits during the rut, I would highly recommend utilizing the recliner to add and move up and down your back to be able to, for those all-day sits, to stay comfortable. To learn more about tethered and saddle hunting, head over to tetherednation.com. Maven is building the highest quality optics at half the price of their competitors through their direct-to-consumer business model. They just want to create the best optics for the job, period. Their products are backed with a lifetime no-fault warranty and an incredible customer experience. I'm using the B3 8x30 binos in all of my whitetail hunts. They're super lightweight, so it feels like they're not even there, and they do really well in low light for that small package. You can use the coupon code EastMeetsWest-gift for a free gift with any full-price optics order at mavenbuilt.com. And Go Wild is a free social community built by hunters for hunters. Join me on Go Wild today, and you'll get $10 to spend on gear just for setting up your account. You'll keep unlocking Go Wild rewards, and you can now see my complete gear setups over on the app, just under my name, Beau Martonik. And so you can download it in the App Store or timetogowild.com and use the code EastMeetsWest to save 10% off of all hunting gear on the website, which includes tethered saddles. So check that out, and you will not be disappointed. All right, so as I said on today's episode, we have Bill Thompson here. It's the rut. It's November the 3rd as this releases here, and I'm at work and I am just jealous of everybody that's in the woods right now. And my cell cameras have been lighting up. Things are going crazy. The weather is perfect for this week, at least here in Pennsylvania. And I'm just excited for everyone to get out and enjoy this time of year. It's my favorite time to be in the whitetail woods. So enjoy this podcast with Bill Thompson, and good luck hunting the rut. All right, we're live. Bill Thompson from Spartan Forge. Welcome back, man. This is your third time, I think, you've appeared on the podcast this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other time was with Johnny and Steve.
And then with Johnny, and just Johnny the first time.
And then just Johnny the first time. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's good to have you back on, and we're recording this November 2nd, which is going to go out I'm actually going to release it tonight. So after we're done here, I'm going to go through and edit it and get it up. But it's a hot time of year.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just telling you earlier, when we were getting ready to start recording, that I was driving down the road tonight, knowing I was going to have to head back to my office to do work, and being like, there's nothing I want to do right now other than be out in the woods. It's all I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and you haven't got to hunt really at all other than when you were home in North Dakota.
No, not at all. I hunted a little bit in the beginning of the year just because I had the time, and I quickly ran out of time as soon as I got back home. So,
yeah, the app launch and everything has been taking up a little bit of your time, to say the least.
Just a wee bit.
Yeah.
I mean, between myself and my other two founders, I think we've been averaging between 16, 17-hour days for the past 3 months or so, especially after we launched the beta and we were actually able to address all the issues people were having, which is like a necessary step for a lot of people who've never done app development. You have to push it out to a larger group of people than you could have in a controlled environment. Like 20 people wouldn't work. You need thousands of people. So we were able to push the app out and get that. And then we just had to make all the fixes to all the issues that we came up with. And we're actually, as we speak right now, waiting for it to be for this final build of the application to be approved by Apple. Android's already been approved. Android's always easy, but Apple is always takes. I think Android's review process is automated. And I think Apple actually, they want a person on it looking at it, which is fine, but it generally ends up meaning it's going to take longer. Sometimes it's taken, one time, I think for the beta, we actually waited like 9 days.
Yeah, I remember that.
But for this one, I figured out how to do the expediting process. It's a little cumbersome, but essentially you can request an expedite as long as you have a good reason. So as soon as we submitted, I immediately went and did an expedited review. So hopefully they get back to us here fairly soon. They could get back to us while we're on this podcast.
Nice. Well, that's cool. So have you felt like the beta version has been received up to this point?
I mean, really positively. I mean, we had a couple people who signed up right away that I don't think understood the point of a beta. And essentially it was just, we're going to give you an app that's going to cost, $60 by the end of this year for $20 for the rest of your life, because we know there are going to be issues with the app and we need to fix them. And so we're, essentially giving you, what I think, in 5 years, you won't pay what you'll pay for 1 year of another another app service. So, if you wanted to get like an Onyx or a Hunt Stand or something like that, and you want all 50 states of data and all of these different data things, and then all the additional stuff that they don't offer that we do, you're looking at $150 for the year or $120 for the year. And we're essentially saying, look, if you're willing to be a guinea pig for a month, we'll give this to you for $20 for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And so the initial people that signed up were like, oh, the imagery is not as good here as I need it to be. So, nice try, but no thanks. And then they give up. And I'm like, oh man, that guy's going to be kicking himself here in about 2 months.
Yeah.
Because we hadn't even added our good imagery parts yet. Like we just had like basically our base map. And as I just talked to you about, we're adding a lot more crisper, cleaner imagery in a lot of areas. And it's simply a payment thing and, kind of making relationships and finding the right people and the right repositories of this data. On one of these data ads, it's actually an organization that generally works with the government that I just knew the guys and was able to work out a pretty good deal on some more imagery. So I think some people were a little short-sighted or didn't understand the purpose of the beta. So they got off right away. But I mean, since then, it's been every other day I'm getting a message on Instagram or through Facebook Messenger saying, the app helped me kill this deer on this day, or, I trusted the prediction and this got me here, or, this mapping here showed me stuff I hadn't seen before. Using the historical wind and the polar plots and understanding what the predominant winds are month by month in areas allowed me to be a lot more efficient with my cyber scouting. And I'm getting these stories every other day, honestly. And I'm always making sure to ask people like, hey, I'm going to post this at the end of the year when we're going to do like a wrap up and show all of the people who are, instead of the other applications and stuff out there where people kind of can loosely point to how an application helped them, but people can actually say, look, like, I got the predominant winds, I got the historical information. I chose this area because the buck to doe ratios that I saw in your app were good. and then I understood the predominant wind, and then I looked for and I listened to the prediction. So I went out and I did my scouting, and then I waited for the prediction to say full range or transition or something like that. And then I went in there and I hunted on that day, and I killed this buck that I'd never seen on the hoof before. So that's very gratifying for me. And it's just like dream come true for me to help people in this regard.
No, that's so awesome, and that is one of the things that I hope the listeners of this podcast understand, and others. But like when you have a new app that's developing, like it's a process. It's going to, and especially with a startup company, as you're building things through, it's not going to be perfect right off the bat. You got to look at, and you've helped me kind of understand this from when you first told me about the idea, a while ago, was like, this is something that I'm telling you, we're going to get to this point, but it's going to be in phases and working our way through it. And you just got to be patient with it. But I couldn't be more excited to be seeing these things. And I've been able to see the future of what this is going. And you were showing me a bunch of examples and stuff before this, and you've been over the last, however many months. And it's pretty awesome to see that.
Yeah, I feel like I'm probably, from what I told you the app's going to be, I think we're probably 85, 90% of the way there. And we've got a few more things that we want to do, especially towards the end of this season. And really this season's kind of like our primer for next year. You can think of it as like we're like an NFL expansion team. The point this year is just to get a team on the field and show people that we're competitors and that we're serious. Then next year we're going to kind of bust the door off the hinges. And do a much more aggressive marketing campaign, and much more aggressive with the feature set and kind of pushing the technological capacity of what we can do with things like machine learning. I think we're really going to hit our paces next year. But I feel like our offering right now, from the baseline beta to what we have now as a production application, is a very firm offering as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. Especially for the price.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And so when this does become the full production model, what will the price be then as it releases here, maybe tomorrow?
Yeah, so I believe it's $39.99. I can check that, but I'm 95% sure that's what it is, unless somebody's did something without me looking. We will be adding some mapping, additional imagery here in the next month or so. That will probably jack the price up again about $5. And it's simply, we don't even make money on this imagery piece. Like this imagery that we're adding, the point here is just to add the minimal amount that we need. And it won't be for people who come on now. It'll just be for people who join after that. And then we're going to add the Blue Force tracker functionality, and that'll probably bump it up to like $49 or so. And my goal on the wall is to never see this application go above $59. There are situations where if we get some of the feature set implemented at maybe $69, or maybe we'll do a $59 version and a $69.99 version, but I never want to see it for sure go above that $69. And we're also going to organize and offer a free version of the application sometime next year as well, which is going to have some really cool stuff for landowners and for non-hunters to kind of give them an under the sheets peek at essentially. Very quickly, you can just think of it as if you are knocking on doors trying to seek permission, you can tell the landowner, hey, I'm going to give you a free version of this app, and you can see when I'm in your backyard hunting, or when I'm on your land hunting, or when I'm in here. They won't get all the functionality that everybody else gets from the application, but what they will know is, hey, I'm not going to send my sons in the back today to go get hay bales or something, or to get my little kids to go play somewhere or do something because there's a hunter back there. And they'll have that type of situational awareness. And then there's also safety features and stuff like that we're going to incorporate. And so it'll be a free version of the app for that. And maybe a tuned down version for hunters, but we'll probably have 2 or 3 different instances of the application come this time next year.
Okay. Awesome. And so one of the things that while we're talking about the app here, as we're getting rolling here, is I'm not going to ask you all of the details on using the app or anything. I really think that if anybody wants to check out Garrett Prahl's video, the DIY Sportsman on YouTube, he does a great tutorial on the beta app and going through that and how to understand some of the features. But what I want to talk to you about is, for right now, during this time of year with the rut, specifically focusing on the forecast part of it, with utilizing the movement and the patterns and how to kind of understand that and what you should be looking for as far as good days and how you can be using that for planning out these hunts during the rut here.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways to use the application. If you really know the deer or the does in the area and the bucks in the area that you're hunting, there's like one way of utilizing the application and what the data is that you're being provided from the application. And then if you are maybe doing like an out-of-state hunt or you're going into an area you've never been in before, there's kind of like another way to use it. So one of the common questions I get is like, well, like what's the best type of prediction? Like, is abnormal bad? Is full range good? Is core area not good? So I guess the first thing I'll do is I'll just break down what each one of those things mean very quickly. And then I'll kind of describe the scenarios where maybe one prediction is good and maybe one prediction is bad. So there's 3 different types of movement. And so you can think of movement, it's broken down in 3 ways: core area movement, transition area movement, and then full range movement. Core area basically means the buck or the doe is going to be in and around their core area for the majority of the day. So during your hunting day, your hunting hours, if the prediction is core area, you need to be getting as close to those bedding areas as possible if you want to see a deer on their hoof during the daylight hours. When they're in transition, you can think of that as, physical transition. You can think of that as a scrape line, as a rub line. You can think of that as a staging area. All that the machine is saying is they're not in their core area and they're not in their destination areas, which is where they spend the majority of the nighttime hours. So you can think destination as like a cornfield, as an acorn, an acorn flat or something like that, where the deer are traveling to, but they also seem to assume the most risk when they're in these areas. So if it's like a soybean field, an acorn flat, these types of places where they're exposed, or the machine is saying there's exposure. Transition is in between those areas. So you can think about transition as any of those things I said before, because all of those things occur between the destination and the bed. And then the third prediction is full range. And what full range means is they can be found anywhere throughout the day, but they'll be moving more in all of those areas than they normally would be moving. And then there's the second, system of the buckets that you can find yourself in is in the pattern, which is normal, abnormal, or very abnormal. And I always use kind of like an analogy here. And I think for most people, it makes sense because I even was doing a podcast last night, actually. And the guy didn't quite know. He had his own way of interpreting that and kind of ran with it. And then when I explained it to him, he was like, oh man, this all makes so much more sense right now. But essentially, you can think of it as the buck has the machine recognizes when deer are in their core areas. In other words, their areas during daylight hours where they're securities, whether that's a thicket or it's a knob or a finger off of a ridge or whatever. It's where they're spending daylight hours. And the way that they leave that area to go to where they spend the majority of their night hours or their feeding hours or whatever, generally has a pattern to it based on things like the predominant wind, thermal generation, sunlight, cloud cover. All of those things get a vote, and that kind of determines the way that a deer can scent check an area before they go into it. So if you think about the way that a deer navigates its terrain, there's the way that they do it the majority of the time based on the majority of the wind factors and the weather factors, and that would be the normalized pattern. So if you want to turn it into human terms, you could say when Bill Thompson leaves the house and he goes to work, 90% of the time he's traveling I-95. And then sometimes when there's an accident or traffic spat on I-95, now he's going in through neighborhoods. So that might be my abnormal pattern. And then that might be Bill's traveling out of town and now he's not anywhere on any of these roads. So that'd be my very abnormal pattern.
Yeah.
That's 3 ways of thinking about pattern. For a buck, it can mean, he usually leaves this bedding. He usually J-hooks out of the bedding and moves to the northwest. He's keeping the wind at an angle to his nose so he can scent and see where he's walking. So if the majority of the wind in that November, say, is a northwest wind, then that is the normalized pattern. And the distribution is normalized for that type of movement. Whereas if he gets like a weird south day, he might not even choose that bedding area anymore because it's no longer conducive to the security. So now he's chosen a different area, and he's going to leave that area differently. He might even not go to the field or to the thicket or to the acorn area that he normally goes to. So now he's got an abnormal, type of movement. And when you get into really extreme situations and extreme weather events and those types of things, now you have a very abnormal pattern. So the machine predicts for those three things. So people very quickly will ask, well, like, what's the best type of movement? And my answer to that question is always, how well do you know the deer that you're hunting? If you know where the deer are bedding, if you know where the bucks are bedding, you certainly can hunt on a core area day because you are getting into those areas, and you just have to be really wary and really, like you would any other time you're hunting a bedding area. Get in there very slowly, get in there very early, get in there very quietly, and make sure that the wind is working in your favor and you can hunt those core area days. And then if you don't know the area, then maybe you want to wait for a transition area day or a full range day, because there'll be more movement during the daylight hours where you can kind of learn more while you're there, or you're kind of doing like a sit and learn, where you're not necessarily even trying to, put an arrow in a deer. You're just trying to kind of sit and learn the area. Then you may want to wait for those types of full range days. So for myself and how I use it, it's just, I still wait when I'm hunting a buck's bedding area, which is a lot of my public land hunting prior to the rut. I will still wait for transition and full range days, because even among the most mature deer, I'll find that they change bedding on full range days more often than they would. In the GPS data, when I look in the GPS data, there seems to still be instinctual pressure that the mature bucks are, there's an instinctual pressure to move and feed, maybe because whatever, the crop harvest hasn't been good, acorn production's not great, so fat stores are low, and their body is signaling like, hey, you need to get your fat stores to a certain level before the rut, or you're going to rut yourself to death. So the deer now is sensing a drop in pressure, and it wants to go out and feed. Whereas you'll have 1.5, 2.5-year-old deer out in the middle of the field, or does out in the middle of the field. That 160-inch buck might not be in the middle of that field at 2 p.m., but he's probably changed his bed more often on that day than he would otherwise, which makes him more vulnerable by essence of them just moving more often. Because a lot of times I've had situations where I set right up on a buck that I don't know is there until he's leaving for like the last 10 minutes of sunlight. And all of a sudden he's getting up, and I'm like, holy crap, the deer's been there the whole time. I had no idea. So I generally, when I'm hunting buck bedding areas, still wait for the transition in the full range days. So that's a really long explanation there, but yeah, I hope that kind of gives everyone some context.
No, I think that because out of everything with the app, I think I've received more questions on that section than anything. And that's why I really wanted to cover that, in detail there. And I
should also say that when the production version comes out, next to each prediction, and I'm not even sure if it's on the version that you're testing right now, but on each prediction, there'll be a little I button they can click, and it kind of runs through all of that and explains everything. So that'll be there in the release, in the production release.
Yeah, no, I have heard you talk about it, but I have not seen that version of it yet. But I think that'll be really helpful for everyone there. The best explanations, obviously, and I'll be, as we get into like the winter months and everything, I'll be making a bunch of videos on how I'm using it and how I'm breaking it down and understanding it, and I think that'll help people some more as well. So as I play with it more this fall and continue to test it and see how things operate. So, and one other thing I want to add real quick for another thing I was getting questions on was, when you hit that forecast button, like, oh, the weather wasn't right for my area. Well, what it is when you're on the map, it's wherever you have that little crosshair, wherever that's at, that's where it's pulling that data from. So it's not necessarily where you are currently, it's where that crosshair is. And that's really important because you could be obviously somewhere else and it's not going to give you the right information.
Yeah, we wanted people to be able to quickly scout and like not have to type in areas, or if they knew where they were going, they could just move those cross areas. those crosshairs and get that instantly.
Yeah, and yeah, that's what that's one of the things I just think that I'm glad you explained in the detail that you did there. So, kind of shifting a little bit here, Bill. So, one of the things that within the app, a lot of this information that's being put in there, a lot of that comes from GPS collar data. And I know you spent a ridiculous amount of time over the last 7, 8, maybe even longer years of analyzing this data to get to the point of this app. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as I started getting access to that type of data or started downloading that data or getting it from academics, first I just have the whole process and the whole, just basically the activity and the pattern of deer behavior is something I'm generally just interested in from a personal level. But then also as I was hunting or feeling like I was getting beat by a deer or trying to understand where I wanted to put my next stand or where I wanted to go and hunt or where I should be scouting, I would always go back and reference that data and try to learn as much as I could. And really, I've never gotten bored of it. Like I still get bothered. We'll be getting ready for church here and, people will be yelling at me to get ready and go. And I'll be looking at a buck that I just got information on. Hurry up, let's go. And I'm like, well, I'm looking at buck 11549 right now. Just give me 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
I might still do it. It just happened to me this past Sunday. So I'm constantly looking at it, constantly trying to learn more. And it has not lost its allure to me.
No. And I think it's funny because before I met you and before I did this, I always followed along with Penn State's deer study and I'd watch all the videos of these specific bucks and how they'd move. And I have access to another study that was done on a specific piece of private big woods piece and near me in Pennsylvania. And I just studied that stuff like crazy and was just so interested in why they would make these movements and do this. Well, you took it to a whole nother level and then involved a machine to kind of take a lot of the thinking out of it for it. But when you were doing these manual looking through and reading through these studies, the next kind of series of questions or topics are going to surround that. And with it being the rut and we're focusing on that time of year is doe bedding. Where, we focus a lot. There's a lot of information, including myself talking about buck bedding, but does are the focus this time of year as far as that's what the bucks are. I mean, to not complicate the rut, it's bucks want to breed does. And so understanding where does like to bed is something that I think is important to talk about and touch on. And so in specific in big woods type settings, whether that's hill country, the mountains, or just, other types of stuff, what are some of those types of areas that you've seen that does like to bed in?
I mean, most consistently for does, as it pertains to bedding, it's one of those things where I guess if I had to choose an area, if you showed me a big wood setting, and I'm thinking specifically big woods right now, I would be looking for high ridges and flats along those ridges and areas with lots of vision, you can see a long ways. And basically it's far different from bucks, especially bucks, wary older bucks. The areas there's just nothing in common with them. And then a lot of those types of bedding situations specifically pertain, they're always almost close to some type of food for the does. The does are moving in there. Oh, thank you, honey. My daughter just brought me a beer. So sorry, guys. But thank you, babe. So it's almost so in hill country. Now, there's other situations, especially when there's pressure or when I know the does are being hunted, they can get spooky like bucks. But instead of using you might see, bucks will be bedding on a finger on, and they'll take a finger that gives them lots of leeward protection. Yeah. In other words, a buck you'll find good prime buck bedding in an area where no matter what the wind is doing, the buck can very quickly set himself up to be at an advantage using wind and visibly they can see in front of them or they're near a thicket. Whereas with does, that is not an important thing. But when the pressure seems to get there for does, or as does get old, I'm thinking of one study where I have 7 or 8 year old doe data. they tend to get on steeper areas, especially as they get pressured. So it's not necessarily that they're going to like, an area that's prime for buck bedding or what you would, historically see as buck bedding. They seem to get in areas where it's really steep, but it's still right off of an area where it's a flat or it's a ridge, and then it's focused around food.
Yeah.
So that's like kind of the things that you find there. And on top of that, there's not a lot more specificity that I can get into with doe bedding, because to be honest with you, sometimes it can be very like, why are they bedding there? It makes no sense to me.
And that's what I wanted to say is it's funny because I never really thought of like how to figure out doe bedding by looking at a map other than just walking in the woods and where I'm bumping does at, because sometimes it's so completely random. And what I've learned about does is if you ever find an area where does bed, a lot of times the beds will be angled almost quartering to each other, like they set up in a circle. So they don't need the perfect wind. They don't need the perfect cover because they have eyes. They have a bunch of eyes. They have a bunch of noses in all these different directions. And like the bigger doe groups that I'll find will bed in sometimes in the most random weird spots. If you get a group, it's like 3-4 does, they might be a little bit more strategic with it. Maybe like I was sitting on the edge of this clear cut last year. It was like a 3-year-old cut, so there's some brush growing up and stuff, and they just plopped down in the middle of this brush. They had no visual, but they it was just weird. But and it's funny how they kind of do transition. I think a lot of doe bedding does have to come down to boots on the ground and figuring out. Like the last couple of years that I'd hunted the rut a lot was where I'd found them in early season by me scouting and just bumping does. I just marked those areas, and then you start kind of putting things together when you look at the map and figuring out, the transitions between them, where the food's located at. Like a lot of the times, like you said, the bucks might bed quite a ways away from some primary food, and where the does tend to be kind of sucking tight to those types of areas, whether that be oak trees and an oak flat, or that if there's no oaks in the area, that it could be a logging cut or whatever that might be that would, draw those in there.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And for bucks, like the thing that really differentiates, well, there's many things. Like we could do a whole different podcast on bucks and buck beddings, but the biggest thing for bucks is security. Like food is it's such a distant 2 and 3 for bucks. I've seen bucks where they bed and they move 2 or 3 miles a night to go and get on food. And then they'll move 2 or 3 miles back to get off of, to get out of that area. And it's just like, holy crap, like food is so distant,
yeah.
And it's such a non-factor when you're talking about pressured deer or public land deer, especially. Now it's totally different. And it's so different, in fact, that I don't use high fence deer data. So when I get or unpressured deer data, I hardly ever use, because it almost doesn't train with the neural network. In other words, it can distort the predictions so much to use like fenced deer data, because they will bed on food. Bucks will bed on food in like these areas like their does. And they don't really ever get that like mental maturity that seems to happen around 3.5 or 4.5 years old, where there's like a flip switch, and now they're just a different animal. Yeah, which they truly are. That doesn't seem to happen in that data. So, of course, somebody might be like, "Well, I hunted my family farm for 40 years, and I saw bucks bedding right on the food or right off the food." It's like, yeah, in those situations you'll still see that, but I don't think that's what we're talking about here today.
No, that makes sense. So, after we talked about does a little bit there, how bucks are moving during the different phases of the rut, by looking at this GPS data, is there like, if you break it down, basically from now, even saying to the end of October through the third week in November, what are you seeing like different phases from these bucks and how their movement looks like? Can you explain a little bit of that?
Yeah, it's a bell curve, and it's just like, it's very, you can almost plot it on top of the amount of does that are coming into estrus. It's like amount of does, you might get like a couple early October estrus does, and then it'll peak, maybe in your area, it's November 10th or the 14th or something like that.
Yep.
And then it tails off and it goes back down. It's the same thing with buck movement. Now, I wish I had looked this up beforehand. I'm 95% sure I'm going to give you the right numbers, but I'm just going to thinking about it. So I want to say, I'll verify with you. And if I'm wrong, I'll tell you after the podcast because I store this data and I can look it up and look. But I want to say that early buck movement per hour ranges between about 80 and 150 feet per hour pre-rut, like October 1st to like the 5th, 7th, something like that, before you start seeing those first doe coming into estrus and those first bucks looking for those does. And it'll get up to like 1,200 to 2,000 feet an hour during prime rut. So if you think about that, you're talking about, I don't know, between 25 and 50 yards, I guess is another way to say it, pre-rut per hour. And that's a lot for some bucks. Some bucks it's even less, but it's about the average. And then you'll get them up to, they're covering 4, 5, 6 football fields, up to 10 football fields in an hour, averaging during the rut. And then a lot of these deer, especially out of the Southeast where we have very meticulous data, they'll lose 40% of their body mass. So when you start talking about, they're moving 1,000 yards an hour or something like that. Some of these deer. Now, most are somewhere in the 1,200 feet. So what's that? 300 to 400 yards an hour seems to be like a good number when you average it over a 24-hour period. But a lot of them will rut themselves to skin and bone well during that time of the year. But with the interesting thing, and I think something that's interesting for hunters to kind of conceptualize and understand is does remain pretty consistent. It doesn't really change all that much throughout the year when it comes to does. Female activity actually, as it goes to the prime rut, can actually become less. So they might move between 50 and 100 yards a day. And then during peak rut, they might be at 75 yards a day. And then during mating, it might be 25, 50 yards.
Is that because they're trying to hide from the bucks at that point?
Yeah. When they're being mated, I'm saying is when the least amount of movement is, because what will happen is, or what I see in the data is bucks will push them off to an area, they peel off. One good marker for you're in the peak of breeding is when you start seeing babies everywhere alone. Yeah. That's a good indicator that the peak breeding behavior is on. And it's another thing that's bared out pretty evident in the deer data. And they'll just start, that's when you're seeing tons of fawns or whatever at like 2 p.m. And they're just out doing their thing, just unencumbered by the world and not worried about anything. It's because mama's off and she's busy. And so that is when you'll see some does are really not moving a ton at all. So it's kind of like an inverse, whereas the does are pretty consistent throughout the year. There maybe is a tiny dip during the peak of mating, and then they go back to their normalized distributions as it's concerning movement, whereas bucks are through the roof.
And do you see a specific buck and I don't know if you can see this in the data at all, but can you see say they find a doe that's ready and they kind of lock down with her for a few days, and then all of a sudden they pick back up their activity where they're out searching again and then lock down again? Have you seen anything with that sort of data?
Yeah, so that's funny. I just got that question yesterday from another podcast, a guy that I'd been talking to. And he'd actually asked me this question, and I went back to the data and looked at it and provided him an answer. And generally, I find 3 different types of behaviors. Well, two. I'll stick with 2 for this podcast, just because the third one I haven't seen enough data. But it basically boils down to there'll be bucks that will stick with one doe group and follow that doe group until each one comes into estrus, and then he'll try to mate each one as they come into estrus, or peel them off and mate them as they come into estrus. But he'll basically be focused on that doe group. Then there'll be another type of buck which is running around and checking every doe group that he knows of, and he's constantly moving and it never ends. And there's a third group of bucks, and these tend to be more wily bucks, where they just kind of know when it's on, they'll move in, mate, and leave. And then they're just back up on the hillside waiting, or they might even do more mating during the second part of the rut. But the majority of the personality that I see for bucks is, I hope this answers the question, is essentially ones that will stick with a doe group and just wait for each one to come into estrus, and then ones that will basically scent check every doe group and just continually keep moving. And I think, and I don't know this to be true, but I think that second group tends to be like your zombie bucks. Like when you see these bucks that just look like
I love zombie bucks.
Yeah, they're the best. And I think that is that second group, because they're just constantly like, gotta find her. And those bucks, right? Like that's it's a method, right? And so that kind of, when you understand that about a buck, I think you can kind of apply that heuristic as it comes to trying to hunt those types of bucks, right? Especially during the peak of the rut, when you can do quite well by yourself by just getting downwind of these doe bedding areas and kind of understanding that it's a matter of when and not if a buck's going to come by and try to mate these does.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, I've found just in a few specific cases in the last, 3 years where there was specific bucks I was focusing on, and I had encounters with the deer, and they were some of the biggest, oldest mature deer in that last few days of October. And I've seen them be basically chasing a doe around, and then they disappear from all my cameras. I couldn't find them for up to like 4 or 5 days, and then all of a sudden they'd show back up again, and they'd hit like all of my cameras in one day, and then they'd be gone for a little bit again. Not maybe they were just out of the range of where my cameras were, but my thought process was they found what they needed in a doe, and they were just hanging out there for a little bit.
Yeah, that's that third group, and I'm still trying to get more data because I don't have a ton of data on that group, and it generally tends to be the more mature deer. But, I'll see like two things there. The first thing is I'll see that type of behavior, but then I've also seen behaviors, and now this is the exception, and I say this every time, and I say this because it's rare and it's novel, but it's something cool because bucks can be very individualistic the way that they move. But it's worth to say, I see where there are some bucks who will they know when the first doe is coming to estrus, they'll go down, they'll either mate that doe, or if they don't get to it, they won't participate in the first rut. And then you'll see a lot more participation on the second rut. When either older doe or does that didn't get mated in the first cycle come into estrus, or your younger fawns that now have enough body weight, basically gained the body weight they needed to cycle, because with white-tailed deer, it's body weight. And they come into estrus during that second cycle, and then those bucks go down there. And again, those tend to be your bigger and older deer. And it's interesting because they won't participate in the first rut, or they'll very likely participate in the first rut. And then it's all bets off during the second rut. And so that to me is like very interesting. And it seems like they're much more, they're much more pointed. Like they just go to a specific area, they check the does out, and then they go back to where they are at all the time. Then they might go to like another area, come back, and it's just like they're finely tuned. They know when does are generally, they've seen enough ruts to know, all of the mistakes that the 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds are making. They've seen that enough times. They've seen enough of their buddies get arrows in the boiler room to know that until the does are standing, there's no risk in losing your neck. And it's not even that they know that. It's just that it's a successful pattern of behavior, like a dog or anything else, right? It's just, this is what works for me, and I'm still alive, and I'm here, and I'm happy, so I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah, they're not thinking that hard about it and strategizing. They just, this is what's worked, and they
pattern of behavior.
Yeah, they figured that out. And I've kind of had some theories on like, the real mature bucks versus some of the younger ones. Like right now, my cell cameras are lit up with 2- and 3-year-old bucks just covering ground. I mean, I was out scouting Sunday and had a buck. I was making a scrape literally because my scrape tree blew down, and I was making another one next to it because they were working their way around it. And as I'm pawing up the ground, here comes this 2-year-old 8-point coming in, making scrapes the whole way right into me at 10 yards, and just making a lot more mistakes and doing that stuff, where I've found that some of these other older deer, I feel like they have specific doe groups they like, and that's kind of talking about some of your, where you're talking about breaking it down in those 3 groups or 2.5 groups or however you want to put it. But they have like specific ones that they like to hit, and it's very, I don't know, they're not just full on going for that 2-3 weeks. They have specific times and areas that they focus on and move around with it. And then there's always an exception, but there was this buck I was chasing, and I started chasing back in 2014 or 15, and he would just cover freaking ground. Like, I don't know how he didn't get killed, but I think he ended up dying of old age. But he would cover so much ground. I'd have him in one day 2 miles apart, from morning till dark. And it was incredible to see, the trying to predict these deer is definitely difficult. And I think having all of that data that you've had with, so many colored deer from different areas and different things is really, really helpful with it. Obviously not foolproof, but it helps with it.
Yeah, there's observations there. I mean, I've seen deer 6, 8, 9 miles in a day during the rut, where that's what they're doing the whole time, and they're just continually going. Again, I should also say, just in case I haven't said it yet, I'm not a biologist. All I'm doing is I'm looking at dots on maps, and then I'm making inferences about the data. So I talk to biologists, and I'll ask them things. And a lot of times, I know in the past I've said things where I have like an idea of why a buck's doing something, and then I'll talk to a biologist. I've got access to some pretty good, actually the best in the business, and they'll be like, "No, that's dumb. Don't say that." So I'm like, okay, sorry, it's just my idea. Like, because what we'll do is, and I forget the term, I'm trying to think of it as we talk, but you'll basically project human thought on an animal. Anthropomorphization.
I just had it in my head, but
yeah, and it's
whatever.
Anthropomorphization, I think, is the word. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Again, I'm not a biologist, so feel free to laugh at my expense on how I just try to pronounce that word. But again, I always use the word heuristic because it's like, it's a good enough, I have a good enough working theory that even though it's not right, it's allowing me to pattern what I'm observing and make predictions. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like that. No, that's not what the deer are doing when you think they're doing that, but you could apply that heuristic. You could think of it as like in the military, we always say, clear a pistol 3 times before you hand it to your buddy. And it's like, we got taught that from like, as we were privates, you rack the pistol 3 times and make sure it's clear. And to somebody on the outside, they would look at that and be like, "Hey, dumbass, it was clear the first time. Like, you don't have to worry about it being clear the second and third time." But then what it comes down to is, but people who engage in that behavior don't ever have accidents where they actually shoot their buddy or shoot themselves in the foot, because they've developed something that, although there's no, if it was clear, if you drop magazine and you clear it the first time, it's clear. If you clear it the second time, it's clear again. If you clear it the third time, there's just no way it's not clear. So you've developed a rule that really has no applicability, and it's not the reality of the situation. But when you apply it, it seems to work. And it's the same thing I do with deer. I'll think up like a rule in my head, and even if it has no applicability in the deer woods, it's not at all what's happening. Because I've observed and I've patterned a behavior and I'm applying myself to it, it still works. So I wanted to add that just to say I'm not a deer biologist. I'm probably going to get things wrong. I've learned or observed things that I thought were one way. Then as I got more data, they changed and it turned out being another way. So I just want to add all of that there. Now, that being said, we have about 2,000 years of deer data right now. In other words, if you were to add up every minute that a deer wore a collar and that we have the data and go back in time, you'd be at the time of Christ. That's how much data we have. And I've probably looked at 60 or 70% of that data. So it's just a ton of time spent, maybe 50%, but I've spent a ton of time clicking through deer and just quickly looking through everything they've done throughout their entire life until I find things that are interesting. And so take that for what it is, right? You're talking to a guy who clears a pistol 3 times every time. before he hands it to a buddy. So it is what it is.
I have more trust in you for that. If you, if you're gonna hand me a pistol and you clear it 3 times, I'm gonna be like, okay, I can trust that 100%.
And now what I would say is now you clear it 3 times before you do anything with it.
Yeah, exactly. But before I go into another thing that I want to ask you about your opinions on something, I want to talk about one more thing with this GPS is the lockdown areas. Do you ever see, like, based off of either doe or buck collared areas where they're definitely being locked down for a few days and, they're being bred essentially? What is there anything that you see patterns with that, with the lockdown portion?
Yeah, I mean, generally, again, from what I've observed, when they are together, which I have looked for that in the past, it's like 24 to 48 hours where that doe and that buck are together. And especially in like hill country, so we have access to like live Pennsylvania data where I can go at any time and go and look at what these deer are doing on the ground in Pennsylvania. And I had to like sign forms and do all kinds of stuff in order to get access to this data and say I wouldn't hunt them and all of this type of stuff. But anytime I can go and look. And last year with this data, I was looking during the rut. And one of the things I observed from Pennsylvania, now, again, this is esoteric, right? Because it's just, I've only looked at this data in one section of the country. So people who are listening in like Minnesota, I haven't looked at lockdown in Minnesota. I haven't looked at lockdown in Texas. I haven't looked at lockdown in Florida. Specifically talking about Pennsylvania deer right now. And what I've seen is a lot of areas that are thick in cover and a lot of ditches, like a lot of like cuts and stuff like that. It seems like they get pushed into, and they're in these areas and they'll mate in there for 24 to 48 hours. And then the bucks peel off and they're done and they're immediately on to the next one. Like no time wasted.
Well, they only got a few weeks out of the year, so they can't be wasting time by
there's no
relaxing.
Go and have a cigar and wait, a day or two and recuperate. It's like, nope. Like I've literally seen them where 2 hours later they're with another doe that's standing and is ready to mate, and so and they'll do it right away. So
definitely a stud.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so what I find though is it's cover, it's thick area, it's places where the sunlight can touch the ground, and it's creating, cover and an ability to obfuscate their silhouette so that they can't be seen. And so people generally call that the lockdown phase of the rut. But the other thing I will say is, especially if you're not a picky hunter, it can be a very good time to harvest a 2.5 or 3.5-year-old deer. In fact, I have access to a study out of Texas where they were calling and using like calls, and they were looking at the effect of like how deer react to calls. And during the lockdown phase of the rut, you really get a lot of activity and responsiveness to calls out of your like 2, 3, and some 4.5-year-old deer that aren't locked down with a doe during the lockdown phase. In other words, it's like, oh man, I haven't mated a doe yet, or it's last ditch effort, and now everybody's gone home with their girlfriends, and it's like this buck's at the bar and he's willing to go. It's 2 a.m. for him. Yeah. It's like whatever I hear, I'm gonna. Yeah. So they will respond more to like rattling sequences and calls and bleats because they're getting desperate. So, I mean, if you're not picky and you're willing to get like a 2.5, 3.5-year-old deer, it can be a very productive time is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
A lot of people will be like, oh, it's lockdown right now, I'm done for the next couple of days. It's like, well, if you have the time, be out anytime during peak rut. Because the moment that buck peels off, he's looking for the next girl.
Yep.
So, don't stop.
Yeah, you gotta be there for it to happen. And by the time he shows up and hits your camera or does whatever, you might be too late because he's on the move.
Precisely.
Sort of deal. And it's and especially for people that hunt, say the same areas year after year, you can start learning some of these things for your specific area as well, and understanding, specific doe groups that they like to visit and times when they're moving. And I found a lot of that to be very annual or perennial. It's happening every year around the same times, and they're doing some similar stuff, and that data can be really, really useful when you're paying attention to it. And one of the things that I started doing is I used to always do this just in either my phone notes or in a notebook, but I'd write down, when I'd have encounters and what was going on and all these things. Now, throwing a plug in here, but within the Spartan Forge app, being able to use the journal entry feature, that's I've told you that, and it's one of my favorite features of it, because I can write down, it tags your GPS location, tags the weather that's going on, what's going on. I put all that data in there and it's saved. And you can even add that to the map as a pin, so you can go back and look at it and utilize that data, because you're obviously huge on looking at data and understanding it. And I think, I don't know, I'm huge on it from a deer hunting perspective of looking at, my trail camera data, looking at all these things and trying to make potential predictions in my head, that of a specific deer or maybe a specific area, and learning from it. And by logging that information, because if you think you're going to remember it, you're not. At least my head's not good enough to do that. But I would like to infer that a lot of people are the same way with it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that people will see in the production update as well is you'll be able to, the beta version of the application, you can only take one deer per journal entry. Now you can take many deer per journal entry. And then what you can do is you can go to the My Content space and you can pick, if you name the deer, in other words, if you have a deer with a broken G2 and you call him Lefty, if you name that deer Lefty in every journal entry, you can go to the My Content tab and then you can click Lefty. Then you can look on the map and see every place you've seen Lefty, during that year, which is deer, with the exception of the rut, they stick to their places where they know. A lot of people will say these things, and this is a different podcast for another time, but they'll be like, "Oh, I spooked that deer. He'll never come back." I almost never see that in the data. I almost never see that somebody pushes a deer out of an area and that buck never comes back. And the thing that I say to people is, if you're a buck and you're choosing bedding because you want to be alerted at the slightest amount of disturbance in your area by a predator or human or whatever, or I guess they're one and the same to the deer, and then you're able to escape that intrusion, for you, the area worked. So why would you leave an area that works?
Yeah, to try to test out a new area. Yeah. But
yeah, it's like, now I got to go learn a new place. It's like, no, this place worked for me. I saw that human, from the parking lot. I'm going to continue to be there. It's on you as the predator in this situation to say, okay, he caught me coming from the parking lot. Maybe now it's time to come from the north and sneak up behind him and watch him come in, and that's kind of, you start playing chess there instead of checkers.
Yeah. All right. So the one thing I want to ask you, because Bill, you're not only, somebody that builds an app and looks at a bunch of data, but you also hunt a lot and have successfully hunted a lot through the years. So based off of the data and your own personal experience, what are some of the, your stand type placement, during the rut, and maybe even that's, different parts of the rut, but what are the types of areas you're looking at?
Well, I think one of the reasons why, and I'm going to throw you some credit now. One of the reasons very early on, I've always been interested in your content, but like myself, you're a voracious scrape hunter. And I am a voracious scrape hunter. Every one of my cameras right now that are in the woods, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3, I'd say 80 to 85% of my cameras are over scrapes. And I wait, and these scrapes are all scrapes that are near bedding for does. And what I do is, and it's killing me right now as I see, because my cameras are getting lit up. I will wait until I start seeing bucks near those scrape, for the areas where I know. I'm thinking specifically about this area called Green Ridge State Forest. I know there's like 3 or 4 areas where does are always bedding. And what I do is, I know there's areas where there are certain trees that are good for scraping, and the height of the branches are right, and the area is right, and it's close enough to doe bedding. And I have cameras year in and year out, and they're cellular cameras. And the only reason I go there to those cameras is to either hunt or replace batteries. And all I do is I wait for those cameras to start getting hot, and then I'll move in there and start hunting those scrapes once I know that they're being tended and being worked. And they are, I don't know if you find the same thing. I think you do based on what I've heard in your podcasts in the past, but they perennially, or in other words, every year, those same scrapes will get used in areas, especially like, and the other thing too is, this is 10,000 acres. I've been hunting for almost 10 years. I've got 4 cameras where I know every year on this 10,000 acres, there are community scrapes that's near bedding where these does and bucks will interact on the same camera. And I've got that on there. So, and that's been my thing. Even though 80% of buck activity on scrapes is night activity. In fact, does hit scrapes more during the day than bucks do statistically. I'm keyed on that other 20% of the time. Those bucks are in and around those scrapes during the peak of breeding, because maybe it's because I'm a caveman or whatever, but I can see the scrape. I can see that it's hot. I can get up in the stand. Sometimes you can smell them and you're like, I know this is good. So like when someone else is like, I like to hunt bedding, or I like to be near bucks, or I like transition, all of those things are great. I see reasons to hunt all of those things. But for Bill Thompson, and after looking at the data and seeing all of this stuff, it's just made me more of a believer in scrapes than I ever have been. Even if the bucks aren't working them, they will be in and around them, or trying to scent check them, or just using them as trying to find out who's who in the zoo. So for me, that's pretty much my tactic and technique. And my biggest deer have been killed over scrapes.
Yeah. No, I'm in the same boat with you there. I love scrapes, and I switch from hunting scrapes that are close to buck bedding to doe bedding really in the 3rd week. It can fluctuate. I kind of let my cameras tell me year to year. It changes a little bit when sometimes the end of October I'm focusing still on buck bedding as they're coming back to bed later from checking doe bedding areas. And then there's also, once you get to the point where you start seeing they're looking to get a little bit weird here with some of these does, I want to focus on those scrapes around that doe bedding. And that's what I've seen recently, and I'll focus on that up until, for me personally, till about like November 7th, 8th, 9th, and then I focus to a little bit more of those transition areas with, doe bedding pockets in different areas that might not be focused around all those scrapes or around a specific doe bedding, but I always have a scrape in the area. If I have to build my own, I'll do it. But like that's what I've really tried to do, and have kind of learned I keep adjusting my strategy year to year, and that's kind of where I'm at this point.
I'm always amazed, because for me to adopt that style and start doing that, I had to go to GPS data. Like, in order for me to get to where I'm at and what I just told you about how I do it, it was not until I had 2 or 3 years looking at GPS data. And again, I realize we're both kind of endorsing each other right now, but it's one of the reasons why I wanted to endorse your podcast, because I really think, at least philosophically, we approach hunting the same way. One of my favorite podcasts of yours is with your dad, and he's talking about scraping activity. And I want to say it was last year or maybe the year before. I can't remember when it was from. But your dad, who also, I believe, at least from when I last listened to this podcast, you guys were talking about scrapes and how you approach scrapes and how you hunt all of those things. And it's just, for me, it's like, you have people who've just spent an insane amount of time in the woods, and you have people who've spent an insane amount of time looking at deer data. They're coming to the same conclusion about something. Yeah. For me, being an intelligence officer in the Army, we basically have this way, when you're trying to certify a piece of intelligence, you want multiple ways of arriving at the same answer. It's like the scientific method, essentially. But you've got, essentially 3 or 4 different ways that I can point to scrapes and say scrapes are the right thing. And then when you say, hey, I moved my focus from scrapes around buck bedding to scrapes around doe bedding, around the 3rd week of October or whatever you said it was. That's absolutely something else I see in the data is, and it's another podcast, but like these competition scrapes, or what I call them, that are kind of in between buck bedding or near buck bedding that bucks exclusively seem to be using. And then that transition to scrapes that are near doe bedding. It makes sense to me. It's very easy for me to just embody and understand and then apply myself. And I know I'm doing the right thing when I see bucks working scrapes or fresh scrapes, or you can smell the scrape is like, or it's just been getting worked. But then the last thing I'll say about scraping, and I think you could probably do better. I should start sending you some of these studies so you can look at them. But, for me, it's like the best scraping for me, or the best time for scraping, is like a lot of guys will be getting into an area at like 4 a.m. or something like that. It's like you can wait until like 7 or 8 a.m. for a lot of these scrapes.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them near these doe areas will be getting work between like 9 and 2, like 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. And I see a drop off in the afternoon. I'm not saying you shouldn't hunt scrapes in the afternoon. That's not what I'm saying. There's still a ton of scraping that happens in the afternoon. But what I'm saying is, when I look at the data and the time of day that it's occurring, the afternoon scraping tends to happen closer to dusk, whereas some of the morning scraping morning to like early afternoon is really like a hot spot. When I plot all of the times and I look at it, it's something like, I want to say, and I could be wrong and I'll verify this, but maybe like 55 or 60% of the scraping around the peak of the rut, within 2 weeks of the peak of the rut, happens between like 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. when it's daylight. Now, not nighttime. It's almost always nighttime. But when you talk about just daytime scraping, you can see a lot of it happening between 8 and 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. around doe bedding areas. So, how does a hunter use that? My thing would be like, get in slow at 7 a.m., get up your tree slowly, and sit there till like 1 or 2 p.m., and then move out. One of the reasons I'm not an afternoon scrape guy, and I'm not saying people shouldn't be, you absolutely can do it, but I'll also find a lot of mature bucks will come in and just scent check scrapes in the afternoon downwind at like 30, 40, 60 yards, where you could be downwind of that scrape, and now that buck is downwind of you. And now he's like, hunter and human on this scrape. Whereas that doesn't happen as much as I find in the data. I could be wrong later. In the morning, they're more like, trying to get into those doe groups and molest them and get near them. And they're really they're more aggressive. Whereas, I guess my biggest fear, especially with afternoon scrape hunting, is that the buck smells me, because most of the scraping happens at night, right? So that my scent now is fresh between like 2 and 6 p.m. And now the buck's coming in at 6:45 or 7:15, the sun's down. He either hears me, sees me, or smells me, and just is like, I'm going to avoid this area for a day or two, or I'm going to be much more, I'm educating him less. Whereas, sure, he could be smelling my scent at like my 9 a.m. scent, but it's going to be much more, it's going to have a lot more time to cool off. It will smell like I was there a lot earlier. And bucks, believe it or not, can tell the difference between, just like a dog can, if something was there at 9 a.m. or something was there at like 6 or 7 p.m. So all of that's to say, out of all of that, I still prefer the mornings into the early afternoon, and I generally get off and I'll hunt like a different type of area for the rut. And I don't.
No, I was just saying that's super interesting as far as that afternoon spot and the way that you think about that. And I haven't thought about it in that sort of way, as far as the way they move in those places, and I don't know. I'm really gonna pay attention to that.
It's just a lot of the scraping and a lot of the scrape checking activity happens throughout the night.
Yeah. Yep.
Like when you look at it. And so if I'm getting out of an area where I know there's a lot of scrapes, and I'm getting out of it at like 6:45 p.m., I know I'm bouncing bucks, and that they are smelling me and seeing me, especially with my flashlight on my head, getting out of there late at night, and I could be educating them. Again, these are my theories that I've built up off of, looking at these things. I could be wrong about all of this. It seems to work for me. And I far more prefer killing a deer in the morning anyway. I don't know why, but there's nothing better to me than like pulling a deer out of the woods at 11 a.m.
Yeah, or having all day to get it out, and it's so much nicer.
It's so much nicer.
So one of the things that you said there is about that. I literally just talked about this, but with how you'd rather go in at 7 or even 8 a.m. As you're working your way in and get up, especially during the rut time frame around those doe bedding. That's something my dad taught me when I was younger. Like, I remember when I'd be like, having trouble getting up in the morning just after day of trying to sit all day. He's like, sleep in a little bit, hunt your way in, take your time, climb up in your tree. And what we found is, a lot of these does don't get to that last doe bedding area sometimes until 9 a.m. as it is. They don't get to that spot they're going to set up. They might have a first bedding area, then they come to their like home bedding spot, for the day. And those bucks know that they're can be transitioning. So why would they want to check a bedroom if there's nobody in there yet? And, wait. Yep. And my theory always was that they'd be out feeding or running does at night or whatever. They might lay down for a couple hours first thing in the morning there until everything gets settled back down. And their odds of finding does in those bedding areas is a lot higher when they start moving. And or maybe they're even just crossing doe trails and they know, okay, this is fresh. She just went back to bed an hour ago. And yeah, I agree with that. And I was looking back at it, and the last 4 bucks that I killed during the rut, it might even be 5, had been after 9:30 in the morning and before 2 p.m.
Precisely.
That's no joke. And 2 of them have been on the dot at noon. Like, just I love that time frame. Everybody's out eating their sandwich, sitting in their truck, and I'm sitting there zombie mode in the tree. Yeah, maybe that's why. Maybe they're pushing them all to me. But
well, the other thing too, the other reason I really like it is because, again, I've seen studies where hunting clubs, because they want to learn about their deer, the hunters actually log their time going in and out to stands, and I know where the stands are on the maps, and I've seen what bucks do at like 5:45 when the guy. You're loud. You can't help but be loud unless you're walking like a church mouse. You've got a flashlight on your head that can be seen for miles.
Yeah.
And you're walking in there an hour before sunup. Yes. Can you be successful? Yes. But then you look at guys where they're not meaning to be. And I think on this one study, it was like 8 or 12% of the time they were seeing more mature bucks, and they'd gotten in late in the morning. Now, my theory is they're coming in and they're still hunting in. They're not using a flashlight. There's some light out so they can be quieter, and they can just pay attention as they're moving in with that first light. They're not using a flashlight. They're not as loud. They're not falling over sticks or being loud with the leaves. And basically still your hunt way into the stand, get up, set up, and wait for that 8 a.m., 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m. movement, and then get out of there so that when the night bucks do come by, my thought is at 7 p.m., they're like, they can smell a human, but they're also smelling a human that they know was there 5, 6, 7 hours ago.
Yeah.
And not one that just left the tree stand. So again, it's like a weird way of thinking, but it's worked for me. Like the biggest buck I have mounted in my house right now was a 155-inch Maryland buck that I killed over a scrape at like 8:45 a.m. And it was exactly that scenario where I got in there at like 7:15, light of day. I watched bucks chasing as I walked in. The woods were on fire. I got up to the stand and I watched this buck work like 2 or 3 scrapes before he finally got to me and put an arrow in him at like 9. I want to say it was 9:30 or something like that. But to me, it was like this. To me, I liked it so much more because I didn't feel like I was being as intrusive to the deer woods as I would be at like 4 a.m. Now, sure, you can go in there at 4 a.m. and make a bunch of noise, and yes, it will calm down by like 2 p.m. But I would think that the bucks that are seeing those lights in the woods where they generally don't see them are like, oh, okay, I'm just going to avoid that area. Again, I don't have a ton of data on that. This is my working theory. It works well for me, and I'm going to continue to do it.
Yeah, no, and the one thing that I will say on that is, like, for me, when I'm hunting buck bedding, it's different. Like, because I'm
absolutely
100% different, and that's when I'm trying to get early season or so. Like I'm getting in there earlier to try to catch them coming back to bed. That's a whole different game plan.
Absolutely, I'm getting in there as early as possible.
Yes,
On those days, I'm getting in there. I'm talking about
rut.
What I do is I work 2.5 weeks back from prime rut for about 80% of the U.S. When it gets to be 2.5 weeks back from prime rut, and I've shifted my hunting to scrapes, I'm getting in there at first light.
Yep.
Now, very early first light, I'm basically leaving the truck once I can start to see without a flashlight. And that's when I move in there. And I try not to use the flashlight. I try to move slowly. I will sit against trees if I hear noise, and I will wait. Sometimes it can take me an hour and a half to move 30 yards, 40 yards, because there's a lot of movement, or I'm just weary or whatever. And I'm moving as slow as I can. I'm trying to make, especially if it's like a crisp morning, I will take a ungodly amount of time. If it's crisp and silent and dry, I will take forever to move 40 yards to a stand. I'm serious. Like, I'll take forever. I'll take 3 steps, wait by a tree and look around. 3 more steps, pick my next tree, wait and look around and move in slowly like that. Again, just because for me, it tends to work better.
You got to get with Johnny on his strategy on how he gets close to trees. Have you heard about it yet?
I can't wait to hunt with him.
You wait. He taught me how to walk like a deer and how to do the whole heel to toe thing, and like how not to sound, or no, it's not heel to toe is how we walk, and you want to flat foot it as you're going up, and he almost makes more noise as he's doing it because it sounds like hoofs coming in the ground rather than the human rocking their foot as they're going. He has me thinking a whole different way about it, and that's Johnny to a T from millions of freaking hours in the woods of learning this stuff. He doesn't learn anything from anybody else other than Johnny's thoughts.
I cannot wait to get into Johnny's deer camp for the veterans hunt and to spend that week with him. He is seriously one of my favorite people in the world. Yeah. And the guy would give you a shirt off of his back, and he's just genuinely one of the best people I've ever met in my life. But also he is a riot. Yeah. Just hilarious. And a great hunter, and would give you the shirt off of his back to anyone. So just you talking about it just gets me excited, because he'll text me and update me on developments for the veterans hunt, like things that are going on and stuff. And I'm like, crap, I just want to be with him right now, getting stuff ready. Like, can I just go over there and do that, please? I know. I can't wait.
And the last thing I want to ask you with talking about what you do with the scrapes there. So what are you doing in the afternoons? So once you're transitioning from say 2 p.m. or whatever, you're leaving that scrape set up, what are you hunting for the afternoon?
Generally, a lot of times I'm not. Generally, what I'm trying to do in those afternoons is like spend time with the family, go home and get dinner. Yeah. Like now that I have kids, if I didn't have kids, I didn't hunt as crazy as I do now, especially during the rut. And if I wasn't then, probably what I would be doing is moving to like a funnel or something, where I might hope to catch like a late mover or someone that's just trying to get somewhere destination. Yep. So that I'm not scaring them on the way out. Yep. Like trying to not affect the deer woods as much as on the way out. But like these days right now, if I'm hunting around where I live at like 2 p.m., 2:30, maybe 3, I'm leaving the woods quietly and slowly, and I'm still hunting my way out and just hunting on the way out. Maybe I'll do like a grunt sequence or something and try to catch some crazy buck that's just looking for a fight or something. But I'm generally hunting slowly on my way out. And if I had the time, or like maybe during the veterans hunt, if I go out and hunt for a full day, I'll move to some kind of like choke point or something and try to catch a zombie cruiser.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to getting to spend some time with you during the veterans hunt, and we'll be doing a full podcast with a bunch of different people on it at that point, maybe even probably multiple podcasts, and it's going to be just absolutely epic.
It's going to be awesome, and there's more people coming that I haven't even talked about, and we're going to be doing more giveaways before it for more stuff, and so just stay tuned to our Instagram and to your Instagram, and I think it's going to be the best time that you can have in the deer woods with a group of guys is what we're about to experience here in about 10 days or so, or however long the way it is.
Yeah, I know. It's coming quick. And so anybody can go find, should be able to find the Spartan Forge app in the app stores real soon here. And then also it's SpartanForge.ai, Instagram, Spartan Forge, and then Facebook, Spartan Forge Technologies, if I'm thinking it correctly.
Yep. Absolutely.
So there we go.
Thank you, Beau.
Covered that for you. So
very good. Thank you. No, it's great. And I'm still answering probably 30 or 40% of the messages on social media. And if people have a question for me, they can just put like, this is for Bill or whatever. And I'll I try to get to those and answer those once a week. I'll usually spend an hour or two drinking whiskey and answering most of those messages. And that's something I want to continue to do no matter how large this company gets. So if people have questions for me, please hit me up there and I'll do my best to answer them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bill. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Beau, for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of East Meets West Hunt with your host, Beau Martonik. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit eastmeetswesthunt.com, Facebook at East Meets West Outdoors, and Instagram at East Meets West Hunt. If you enjoyed today's episode, please review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.